I used to think I was someone who just hadn't found the right thing yet. That's how I explained it to myself for a long time. Every time something stopped feeling exciting, I told myself the same story that the discomfort was a signal, that the slowness meant something was wrong, that my instincts were telling me to move on. I moved on a lot. And every time I did, the beginning felt like proof that I'd made the right call. There's something about starting over that feels almost medicinal. Everything is fresh again. The ideas are clean. The possibilities haven't been touched yet. You're not behind on anything because nothing has started. There's no gap between where you are and where you imagined you'd be because you just reset the imagined version too. I didn't recognize this as a pattern for a long time because each restart felt justified. It wasn't random, there was always a reason. The previous thing wasn't working, or it wasn't aligned with who I was becoming, or I'd learned something new about myself that made me think a different direction made more sense. The reasons were real, they weren't made up, but I started to notice something uncomfortable when I looked back at the trail of things I'd left behind. None of them had been given enough time to show me anything. I'd leave before I had any real information, before the thing had a chance to respond to my effort, before I had any actual data about whether it was working or not. I was making decisions based on feeling, and the feeling I kept responding to was the absence of excitement. When something stopped feeling exciting, I read it as a sign. I don't think I understood at the time that excitement has a very short shelf life in anything real. The beginning of something new carries a particular kind of energy that has almost nothing to do with the thing itself. It's the energy of potential, of not yet knowing what's hard about it. You're essentially in love with a version of the thing that doesn't fully exist yet. And that version is always better than what actually shows up a few weeks in. A few weeks in, it's slower, more repetitive, less responsive. You're doing the same things over and over and not seeing the kind of movement you expected. The feedback loop that felt so tight at the beginning, where everything you did seemed to produce something, starts to widen. You do something and nothing happens for a while. Then you do it again and still not much. It starts to feel like you're pushing against something that isn't pushing back. And that feeling, that quiet, flat, unresponsive feeling, I kept reading it as information. My brain kept saying, this is the part where you find out this isn't right for you. But I'm not sure that's what it actually was. I think what it actually was just the middle of anything, the part after the beginning and before the results, the part that doesn't have a good story attached to it yet, the part that's just work with no particular narrative momentum. Nobody talks about the middle the way they talk about the beginning or the turning point. The beginning is interesting because it's new. The turning point is interesting because something shifted. The middle is just the middle. You're not new anymore, but you're not proven either. You're somewhere in between, doing things that feel uncertain, unsure if they're accumulating into something or just disappearing. I think the brain genuinely doesn't like this phase. It's not dramatic, it's not rewarding, it doesn't produce a chemical response that novelty does. And so the brain starts looking for an exit. Not because something is actually wrong, but because this is just uncomfortable in a very quiet, persistent way that's hard to tolerate. The problem is that the exit the brain offers doesn't look like an escape. It looks like clarity. A new idea starts to surface, and it feels different from distraction because it feels meaningful. It doesn't feel like you're running, it feels like you're realizing something. There's a specific quality to it. It arrives with a kind of calm confidence that makes it feel like insight rather than impulse. You start to think, I've grown past this thing. I understand now what I actually need to be doing. This new direction is more aligned. And maybe sometimes that's true. I'm not saying every new idea is avoidance, but I kept noticing the timing. The new idea always showed up at the same moment. Not when things were going well, not at the beginning, not when I was energized. It always showed up when the current thing had entered that quiet, flat, repetitive phase, when the excitement had worn off and the work had become routine and the results were unclear. That's when the alternative arrived, every single time. And I started to wonder if the idea wasn't finding me, if I was, in some sense, generating it, as a response to discomfort. Because there's a difference between getting a new idea and needing a new idea. And I think I kept needing one. The restart itself became the reward. Not the building, not the outcome, not the progress, the restart. The act of beginning again produced enough of that early phase energy to feel like momentum, like I was moving, like things were happening. But it was a very specific kind of motion. It was motion that never left the starting area. I was running laps around the beginning, and I'd convinced myself that laps counted as distance. There's something I had to sit with for a while that I didn't fully want to accept. That boredom in the context of building something isn't usually a signal about the thing. It's a signal about the phase. And the phase is not optional. You can't skip it, you can't outsmart it or find the path around it. Every version of whatever you're trying to do has this phase somewhere in the middle where it stops being exciting and becomes a job. A quiet, repetitive, unglamorous job, where you're doing things that feel small and you're not sure they're adding up to anything. I kept treating that phase as diagnostic, like it was telling me something was wrong with the path. But I think for most of the things I abandoned, nothing was wrong with the path. The path was just in its least interesting stretch, and I wasn't willing to stay in it long enough to find out what was on the other side. There's a particular thing that happens when you restart too many times. You start to lose access to a certain kind of knowledge. Not information, you can always get more information. Not skills exactly, though those suffer too. It's more like continuity. When you stayed in something long enough to be bored by it, to be frustrated by it, to question it seriously and decide to stay anyway, you develop a different relationship to it. You're not working on it anymore because it feels good. You're working on it because you've decided that the feeling isn't the point. That's a different mode entirely. And you can't get to that mode at the beginning, you can only get there by passing through the part you want to leave. I never got to that mode in most of the things I tried. I'd be operating on excitement, then on uncertainty, and then I'd leave. I never got to the part where I was doing it anyway. And so I never found out what I was capable of when the feeling wasn't helping me. That's actually the thing I ended up needing to know most. Not whether I could perform when I was motivated, most people can do that, but whether I could keep going when nothing in the environment was encouraging me to. That's the question the middle phase answers, and I kept avoiding the question. The restarts felt productive because there was activity. There was planning, there was research, there was a creation of new systems and structures. All of it looked like work. Some of it genuinely was work. But the function of it was different from what I told myself. The function was to stay in a zone where I felt competent and interested. And the moment that zone shifted, the moment I became one of many people doing the same thing slowly, without any particular advantage, I found the reason to go back to the beginning where I could be new again, where I could be learning again, where I hadn't been tested by the boring parts. I think there's something worth being honest about here. A lot of what gets described as pivoting or evolving or not being attached to outcomes is sometimes just an avoidance of the phase nobody wants to be in. The words we use to describe our restarts are often very sophisticated. We talk about growth, about alignment, about following what's true for us. And those things are real. Those conversations matter. But they can also be the most convincing story we tell ourselves on the way out of something that just got hard in an unremarkable way. There's nothing dramatic about the middle phase. It doesn't ask you to face a crisis or make a heroic decision. It just asks you to show up on a day when nothing is particularly interesting and do the work anyway, and then do it the next day and not interpret the low feeling as a verdict. That's all it asks. And somehow that's harder than most of the dramatic things, because the dramatic things give you something to respond to. The middle gives you nothing, just the absence of signal, just the routine. Just the question of whether you're actually serious about this, or whether you were only in it for the beginning. I stopped treating new ideas as automatically trustworthy. That was a slow shift and not a clean one. I didn't become someone who ignores new ideas, I just started paying attention to when they arrived. If something new surfaced during a period of discomfort or boredom, I started letting it sit, not acting on it immediately, not dismissing it either, just letting it exist without doing anything with it for a while. Sometimes, after a few weeks, it still felt compelling, and that told me something. More often, it faded. It had served its purpose, which was to offer an exit. And once I didn't take the exit, the idea lost its urgency. That told me something too. I'm not sure I figured this out completely. There are still things I've left, and I'm not sure leaving was wrong. Some genuinely aren't right. Some directions genuinely don't suit you. The problem isn't that people ever quit. The problem is quitting before there's any real information. Leaving before the boring phase has run its course means you'll never know if the boring phase was a problem or just a phase. And if you keep leaving at that moment, you'll carry a version of yourself that has never stayed anywhere long enough to find out what's on the other side of boredom. That version keeps starting over. Each time with full belief that this time it's different. This time the path is right. This time it feels more aligned. And maybe sometimes that's true. A little, each time marginally better chosen. But the phase in the middle still comes, and it will keep coming with every version of the right path you find. Because that phase isn't a feature of the wrong path. It's a feature of doing anything long enough to actually matter. I'm still somewhere in the middle of something right now. I don't particularly enjoy it. It's not exciting. It's not producing the kind of feedback I'd like. There are days when a new direction surfaces and feels very reasonable, and I have to just notice it and keep going. I'm not sure I'm handling it better than I used to, just more consciously. And I suppose that's about where I am with it. Not resolved, not finished, just continuing.